there are 4 great scientist warnings to humanity, and they pretty much sit alongside the IPCC reports. The International Panel on Climate Change, so a subsection of the United Nations, which produces effectively the biggest reports on climate change that have been going on. So in 1992, there was the World Scientist Warning to Humanity, which told us we were on a collision course with the biosphere. That's 1992. And it was, when it was issued by 1,700 scientists, including more than half the Nobel Prize winners in science at the time. 25 years later on, as we'd done absolutely nothing, there was the World Scientist Warning to Humanity, a second notice, which said exactly the same thing, said we completely ignored it and it was much more urgent. The important thing to know, though, is that was signed when it was issued by 15,500 scientists. Now, all of these warnings tell us the biggest things that we need to do, and they cover the last 3, particularly 6 key areas: nature, energy, food, economy, population, and pollutants. And the last one has also covered leadership. And leadership is every single person in this room. And there's a couple of councillors in it. It's particularly the couple of councillors, because it's on your watch and my watch. It's happening now, and we need leadership from everybody. Now, let me just take you through a little bit of a journey of why I've ended up standing here, and I'm not sitting in the audience. And then I will talk a little bit about maybe the latest IPCC report, because it's sort of relevant about the latest shoutings from the scientists to give it to you, and then hopefully we'll have a bit of time to sum up. Going back, I was just somebody who was mildly worried about doing my recycling and everything else, and I've spent most of my life traveling around the world and doing other things. I'm originally an army officer, a city lawyer, and then I ran my own company in marketing. And then in June 2019, on the 3rd of June, I had this itching for a while that I should do something. And I thought, what could I do? So I started World No Disposable Cup Day. It's the most ridiculous thing. You get a plastic and paper, you put it together, you go and get your coffee, and really you could just have it as an espresso, or you could sit down and enjoy it. It's absolutely ridiculous that we take these things that are so difficult to recycle, and then we use them for this habit. Anyway, having started that, the result of that, for those who are internet savvy, you may have seen Boris Johnson having a disposable cup pulled out of his hand 2 years ago on about October the 2nd, which was 2 days before World No Disposable Cup Day. But after that, I became like a sponge. It's amazing, and for those of you that seem to be very aware in here, the minute you step across that line into being climate aware, you get bombarded by all this stuff that you didn't look at before because you were more worried about, I don't know, your rates and your taxes and your heating, or Manchester United, or today Chelsea, whatever it was. You were more worried about it and you didn't really concentrate. And then you get bombarded by all the information that's really been out there for years. And what that happened to me is and the scientist warning was one of them. So I read the scientist warning that had been issued by 15,500 scientists. It was about 3 weeks later on, so it was still in June 2019, and I had a nightmare. I'm a single father, and I have been for 10 or 11 years now. And my kids at the time were 2 boys, 11 and 13. And I had a dream in which they were back in their 30s, and they were in their army kit. And they were returning back to our semi-detached in Hazelmere in Buckinghamshire and dropping their green army bags in at the door as they came in. And then they come in to find me in my dotage, having my coffee or beer or whatever in the living room. And they come up to me and say, "Papa, we just got back from Europe, where we're shooting people to stop them getting the drinking water." And they say to me, "We're shooting the poor people who have smaller guns than us. And we could get killed, but we've got all this great equipment. We've got fantastic flak jackets and bigger guns, so most of us aren't dying, but we're shooting them so that you can continue getting drinking water, and you in Britain can continue the luxury lifestyle you've had all that time." And then they say to me, "You knew about this 20 years ago, didn't you, Papa? And what did you do about it?" Then I start waking up, and I've got a tear running down my face, and I'm mouthing the words, "But I had to look after you. But I had a mortgage. But I had a job." And I just put my feet on the ground as I was getting out of bed, and I internally did F.G in my head, and I went, "It doesn't cut it, does it? I've got to get on and do something about this." So I immediately started trying to work on things. And the first thing I did, actually, apart from talking a lot to people, and I did a few little talks, and then came around the general election. I was taking one of my sons to school, and he basically turned around to me and said, "Oh, Papa, look, can you either shut up about it or get on and stand in this general election and make the point?" And I went, And you'll be okay if I do that. Because actually I'd hidden for about the last 10 years, doing everything for my kids I could and not really trying to get involved in other things. So I did. So I stood in the general election in Wickham, which is where hard man Steve Baker happens to be an MP, and I turned the entire election into a discussion of environment. And when Steve Baker won, and he wasn't happy when I stood, but when I won, to give him his credit, he did get up in front of the BBC cameras and say, we're all environmentalists, and he thanked me and the Green Party guy for standing. Then I formed Believers Action on Climate Change, which sadly didn't work so well when the lockdowns came. And then I joined the parish council in Hazelmere with a Z, Hazelmere with a Z. We declared a climate emergency. We have a 2030 net zero target for the community, and we have a lot of actions we're doing, which I can come on to later if there's time. But a fabulous group of people who are now taken up with taking climate action. I then moved into working with Scientists Warning. I got invited by Scientists Warning to join just a volunteer group as it was at the time, and then we formed it into two companies here and in California and formed charities in both places. And I run the one here, somebody else runs the one in America. Subsequent to that, then came round the unitary council elections, and Buckinghamshire is as blue as you can get, and Hazelmere is the bluest of the blue in Buckinghamshire, and they were electing 3 councillors. And again, I stood in the unitary council elections. My only policy was climate action now. So I was an independent with single policy. And I got in instead of the Conservatives. I've been going to get Currys and McDonald's and all these things for about the last 4 or 5 years, and I've never taken any waste. So I take my own packaging in to every single one of them. So into McDonald's, I'll go in, I give them my own boxes, I give them my own cup, I get everything with no packaging, and I've done it for years. And I post on TikTok. And then one of them, when I posted, I think it was Getting with David, 2 donuts and a coffee and a hot chocolate. And I handed in my box, I got the donuts back, and then I posted it on TikTok. And in the afternoon, we were driving off to my sister's in Kent, and one of the kids is going, when did you post this? And I went, oh, about 4 hours ago. He said, it's like 100,000 views now. And then we drove a few more miles, 105,000, 110,000. I think it's about 370,000 views now. And that's, in terms of, that's how interested people are in the topic, actually, of plastic and plastic waste. Although I have to say, plenty of them are saying that you must be interesting at parties and sort of vilifying me and that sort of thing, but lots of others jumping to my defense. The scientists have been telling us again and again and again and again, and you saw in the film one of the scientists say, how can they shout louder in bolder font to make anybody realize? There isn't any new information. And if I tell you that the chances of desolation are 20%, and then I say it's 40%, does it make any difference? If I tell you it's an 80% chance of society breakdown or a 90%, does it make any difference? No, not really. And we should be following the precautionary principle. And actually, I have to say, I compliment everybody in here who's wearing a mask, because that's following the precautionary principle. It's not maybe not necessary, but it shows a precautionary principle is what we should be showing towards the earth. Now, the IPCC brought out on the 28th of February this year the AR6 report, a second section. So it's an assessment report. It's basically a review of science from previous reports. And one of the ladies, because now let's get topical about what's happening in the world, one of the ladies who was writing the report, a lead author, is a lady called Svetlana Krakowska. And Svetlana is Ukrainian, and on the day they brought it out, one of the Russian authors apologized for what Russia was doing. And Svetlana, though, stood up and said at the IPCC meeting that the war is being driven by fossil fuels. Now, I'm not sure that that is entirely the only reason, but we're actually allowing Putin to do it because we're funding him through paying for his fossil fuels, and fossil fuels are driving the tanks, and there's a whole lot of other connections to it. And I got in contact with her on LinkedIn. I'd met her in COP26, and we talked about something which I'll come on to later, methane release. And her comment back to me on LinkedIn is, it's about a week ago, thank you, Ed. We are still fighting for Ukraine, for Europe, for humanity, and will soon be winners. And she's been in touch since, and she's now been quoting in the press about the difficulties that they've had. But she was an author on the IPCC report that came out. Now, let's talk a little bit about the IPCC report. But just before I do, one other quote. Of all the challenges faced by the global community, one has grown clearer than any other in both urgency and importance. I refer to the threat to our global environment. Well, that wasn't at the start of the IPCC report. The gentleman over here will be pleased to hear that was Margaret Thatcher in the UN General Assembly in 1989. So in 1989, she was saying something that could have been in the IPCC report today. So this last report, 28th of February, written by 270 scientists from 67 countries and could be commented on by up to 200 governments. And probably wasn't. There were probably only a few dozen who commented. Quotes from that: 3.5 billion people are vulnerable to climate change. Degradation of our environment is accelerating. Climate change impacts are becoming increasingly complex and difficult to manage. Multiple climate hazards occur simultaneously. They will interact and compound the overall risk. Weather and climate extremes are causing economic and societal impacts. If warming exceeds 1.5 degrees, many human and natural systems will face severe risks. Now, if we go over that 1.5 degrees, they say, depending on how high and long is the overshoot, some impacts will cause release of greenhouse gases, and some will be irreversible even if temperatures drop again. Now, they wrote a report with very similar warnings in it, actually, about 8 years before, AR5. But these are the same warnings, but they have more red lines on it. So now all these things are really likely, and they put it in very likely, very high percentage, whereas in AR5, they were slightly less likely. You know, we've gone from 40% to 70%, or whatever it might be. Now, COP26 came around. Was it a success? Yeah, I mean, there's a few step or two forward. Coal was mentioned. There was an agreement on the stopping deforestation. There were some things there that were positive, but did it go forward far enough? No. We made one step forward, and we need to walk to the back of the hall. So we didn't really get there at all. And I was in the last session in COP26, and still in the last draft, there was actually a big statement in it saying that we're going to rise, the greenhouse gas emissions are going to rise by 13.7% by 2030 on our current trajectory. And the UN has told us they've got to go down by 45% to give us a chance of staying under 1.5 degrees. Between 1.5 and 2 degrees, we will pass the global tipping points. Okay, and one of the most famous was mentioned, and that's that the Amazon could start to emit carbon as opposed to be a sink for carbon. But it's probably not the most dangerous. And the IPCC report, the quote I gave you they said that there will be more greenhouse gas emissions from natural places because of us going over 1.5. Well, the ice shelves and the permafrost in Siberia, so the frozen land, those things contain or hold in vast amounts of methane gas. And methane is 85 times more warming in the first decade or two than carbon dioxide. It is terribly dangerous for us currently. Now, when those ice shelves and the permafrost go and the methane comes out, there are various studies. But just on the Arctic ice shelf, which is 1/4 of the ice shelves, okay, and not including the permafrost, the two studies suggest that the world will warm over a year or two by 0.6 or 1.2 degrees on its own from that one thing. And that's 1/4 of the ice shelves and not including the permafrost. So depending on who you talk to, and I talked to Svetlana Krakowska at COP26 among others, you could see a warming of anything between 0.5 degree to 4 degrees, possibly. In order to stay under 1.5 degrees, every time we put carbon into the atmosphere, so methane or carbon dioxide, we increase the blanket around the Earth, and that holds in more of the sun's energy. The more carbon we put into the atmosphere, the higher the temperature goes, and they are directly correlated over the last 50 years or so. So the IPCC, that great body who tells us everything, has told us we have a maximum amount of carbon we can put into the atmosphere to stay under 1.5 degrees. Now, miraculously, in their last report, they suddenly found some more budget from somewhere. It's a bit like going to number 10 and trying to work out what they're going to put in the next, budget report. But anyway, they found some more budget. But based on the last assessment, which is an increased carbon budget, the world's carbon budget runs out in 2028 for 1.5 degrees. So 0. Turn lights off, stop all factories, stop driving your cars. 0 from 2028. And beyond that, we start polluting the world. We in Britain, everyone has in the world, 40 tons of carbon they can emit. And that's assuming that industry emits nothing. So that's our personal emission if there's nobody else emitting. Now, that 40 tonnes, taking one of the assessments here, which is from the World Wildlife Fund, would give us 3.5 years in the UK before we turn our lights off. And if we don't, we are polluting the rest of the world and destroying habitats and areas that other people are living in. Okay, so we have 3.5 years. If you take the government's assessment, which is 5.5 tonnes, it's probably about 2028. But either way round, there is very, very little time left. It is vastly urgent that we get on with it now. Now, on a sort of further prediction, I mean, Sir David King, so the world's scientific advisor from before, he made a statement at COP26, which he has repeated, and others have said that he's being too extreme. But in the sense of the precautionary principle, he has said that by the end of next century, on our current trajectory, 20 degrees of warming on the planet. Now, if one of the world's top scientists, he's not on his own, but others are saying that that's too over the top. But 20 degrees means nothing living on the planet at all. Zero, nothing. Insects, no trees, no plants, nothing living by the end of next century. Now, I'm not saying it's going to happen. I'm trying to give you an example that we will run out of the opportunity to continue polluting if we want a safe world. So in 2028, the world will have gone beyond its safe limit based on the IPCC data, which is conservative. What are we going to do about it? I mean, are we going to get international agreement? No. So 26 COPs, no action. Or, yes, sorry, action, but we're never going to get international agreement. Why? Pope says it in Laudato Si. He's not the only one. Justin Welby says similar things. They all do. We're not going to get it because of all the vested interests of all the countries, which actually comes down to all of our own personal vested interests as well in who we vote for and what we do. Lord Deben in a talk, so Lord Deben is the head of the Climate Change Committee in the UK, the independent advisor to the government. So Lord Deben, and these are my words, not his. He'd really tell me off if I suggested these were his words. But in a talk with the Financial Times, he effectively said that Britain will not take enough action on climate change until the body bags line up. Now, he didn't use those words, as I say. I'm just, before anybody quotes him from that, but that's effectively what he said. And what was he meaning? He's meaning that here, our government is not going to take the right action needed until it gets too late. And then when we start to see death and pestilence, to put it in a biblical sense here, we'll pick the phone up and we'll go to everybody else, great, God, we've got to help, we've got to stop this thing, let's do it now, let's do it quicker. And when we ring up all those countries in a decade or two's time, they're going to go, forget it. We've got no water. We're all migrating to get out of the country. We're fighting wars now over our agricultural land because everything's desertified, and they won't be able to help. So we need to incredibly move up our game now before we get to that point. And Hazelmere, just to give you an idea of a few things that we're doing, to give you ideas what the community can do, what councils can do, etc. So we declared a climate emergency. We set a 2030 net zero target. Essential. If you don't declare and commit yourself and don't set a target, you won't get going. We then set up a working party immediately to get working on it. We created the Hazelmere Climate Talk. So every single month we have a climate talk like this on a different topic. We've done 22 now. We set up advanced recycling. We set up a repair cafe, repairing things locally that people can't get repaired easily otherwise. We're doing a plan to put solar panels on parish council buildings, but the reason we're doing it is about saving carbon, but it's more about an example to the community. Have an area where people can come in and find out about that and about heat pumps. We're creating a 2030 plan to get to net zero. We're involved in No Mow May, so we're going to try and not mow our verges and other areas. We're putting in wildflower meadows. And now just a mention on biodiversity. Biodiversity, as I think the gentleman here mentioned, is just as important as the climate issue. And the loss of our pollinators particularly, which have been decimated in the UK in previous years. So we've invented something called B squared. And B squared is this. So there you go, there's a little B squared. And what we did is we have 3,500 houses, so we bought wildflower seeds, we distributed them to every single house, and we said, we want you to put in your front garden 1 meter squared of wildflowers. So they dug up their grass or whatever, and if they didn't have a 1 meter squared or in the flat, put in 3 or 4 pots and put them in instead. We had about every 20th house do it, and this was a little sign they could then put up in their window to say they were part of the project. It was wildly successful, and behind it came everyone in Hazelmere talking about climate and biodiversity issues. They're all aware of it because of this project. This is what brought it through, and everyone got involved. There are 40 volunteers delivering everything and that sort of thing. It's now been copied in about 20 to 25 towns and parishes in Buckinghamshire. We're really hopeful that maybe next year we can get in every single place, and not only in Buckinghamshire. So pretty much every time I do one of these talks, but even without me doing talks, people are finding us and coming to ask how we're doing it and copying it. So there's probably 30 or 40 of these projects happening around the country. And what we're doing is we're putting in pollinator corridors so that the bees, particularly the non-hive bees, can actually, and other pollinators, can move between areas where they need to pollinate. Because one of the problems in Britain is too much monoculture agriculture. So that's singular types of crop, too much grass and too much concrete, and that when the bees can't get from one place to another. So the World Wildlife Fund says we have 17 bee species that are regionally extinct. So they exist in one town or area, and they can't get to the other one because of all this stuff in between them.